Hey, everybody, welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It is a joy to be with you today. I've got whiplash, everybody. We're almost at the end of January. I can't believe that 2025 just started. But boy, oh boy, with this Trump presidency, he's signing executive orders, DEI out the window, not just in the federal sector, but in the private sector. Oh, the January 6ers, they were freed, including those who hurt police. Ow. Wait a minute. Let's talk about the police. Let's talk about consent decrees. What are consent decrees and why are they so important? Hey, Andre. Hey, Bernadette. Everybody, like and share, like and share, like and share wherever you can. I'm understanding that then you are not able to really like on YouTube, but keep on trying, or like on Facebook. But whatever you do, share the show. Because we've got to talk about consent decrees because along with DEIA, thank you, Attorney Darrell Jones, for correcting us. You said, wait a minute, it's not just about diversity and equity and inclusion. It's about accessibility for people who are differently abled, right? Well, now we're looking at consent decrees. So people in Louisville have had something to say about that. Breonna Taylor. People in Memphis. People in Chicago. People all over the country. I'm now wondering, what does this say about how we deal with the police? And I cannot wait to talk with you, Jamie Calvin of the Invisible Institute. Of course, she's got a tremendous film. We're so excited. It's nominated for an Academy Award. I can't believe I actually have someone who could be clutching an Oscar in his hands on my show. This is so exciting. But you've been doing so much work at the Invisible Institute, making that which is invisible visible. And of course, Texas State Representative Ron Reynolds, of course, the chair of Rainbow Push, and of course, he's head of the Black Caucus there, the chair of Rainbow Push, former president of the National Bar Association, and legal analyst on Court TV. You're with us, the chairman of the Transformative Justice Coalition, Attorney Darrell Jones. We've got a lot to talk about today. Because I'm really trying to find out what all of this really means, right? And before I move to you, Jamie, to talk about this movie incident, that's been nominated for an Academy Award. You know what, everyone? If you could give me a brief, well, you're a former prosecutor, Darrell. Give me a brief definition of a consent decree and why they've been implemented.
Sure. Thank you, Santita. At its most basic form, a consent decree is an agreement that's entered into between two parties and is enforced by the court. There's a court, generally a judge, that is overseeing the agreement, and the agreement is entered into by the parties, and then it's abided by. Generally, what happens is that periodically there's a review to see if people are in compliance with the terms of the agreement. It typically takes a period of time really to work out the consent decree, particularly if we're dealing with policing or something like that, because you're going to have FOPs that are involved trying to push certain pieces. You're going to have the county or the city that's involved that wants to be certain that it's shielded from some liabilities, or is going to be concerned about wording and things along those lines. And most generally, you also would want to have a representative from the public that's involved to be able to monitor what's going on from the public's perspective as well. But the consent decrees that we're talking about here with police consent decrees, generally it involves sometimes the federal government, the Department of Justice, and the local policing department. Consent decrees also can involve, it does not need to involve the federal government. It can involve the state government and a local entity as well, or a local government and a local entity. All of those can fit under the consent decree. Typically, we're talking about a consent decree because there's been some type of bad action that has occurred. And the question is, once an investigation is done, how can the bad action or the bad results be addressed? And the consent decree is one of the items that is used, tools that is used to address what has happened and to have it monitored and corrected and for rehabilitative type of behavior.
Well, let me ask you, Texas State Representative Ron Reynolds. We have seen challenges with the police all over the country. and really all over the world. But we have sought remedies, and I'm wondering what your thinking is as a legislator and as someone who's the chair of the Black Legislative Caucus in your state. That we really struggle with the police, and I cannot wait for Jamie Calvin to really go over this wonderful article. It's wonderful because it's so detailed and it's written in a very accessible way, but it is devastating because, Jamie, this took place in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, literally blocks from the place where I grew up. And 71st Street is a big corridor on the south side, and that's like 3 blocks from where we grew up. And 71st and Chappelle, I'm like, wait a minute, that's like up the street, over a few blocks. And you tell me, Texas State Representative Ron Reynolds. I was saying all that to say, Jamie, it hit me in another way, because I said maybe I've seen this young man before, this barber. Perhaps I've seen him walking up and down the street, and I don't know. I mean, because the thing is, the South Side of Chicago, like so many areas, is such a mashup. You can have a wealthy neighborhood next to a working class neighborhood, next to a poor neighborhood, and literally that's what you have. But the good thing about it is that everybody's living together. And the painful part is that even the affluent kids have and maybe that's a good thing. They have the sense that they've got to be very careful because the police can get you. And you need consent decrees. Would you not agree as a legislator? Oh, I think you're on mute. Oh, you genius. It's okay. Oh, you're still on mute? No. But you know what? We're going to work this out because you're still on mute. But let me ask, I want to come back to you because as a legislator, you have a very special place in this conversation. So let's just work that out. Why don't you come out and come back in? But Attorney C.K. Hoffler.
Yes.
Talk to me. I mean, what do you see?
I see massive chaos. First of all, the Justice Department, just like when any administration is ending and a new one begins, the Justice Department and other departments, they try to wrap up business. And there were a number of consent decrees, and there was a lot of great work that was done by their Justice Department in the past 3 to 4 months. They've been working consistently for a long period of time, but particularly in the past 3 to 4 months. And I know because there were some actions taken relative to Georgia as well. So when we see, I don't even believe it's legal, but when we see an administration coming in and throwing out all of the consent decrees for the past 90 days, certainly there are going to be legal challenges to that as to whether or not they can do that. Secondly, of course, it's deeply disturbing when you have consent decrees that touch on police misconduct, not police conduct, but misconduct, and what they cannot do. And there's a reason for the consent decrees. The public, it's in the public interest for the Justice Department to take such a step to protect the people, not Republican people, not Democratic people, but the people. So when you have an administration coming in and making that drastic move, as this one has made on a number of fronts, but more specifically to get rid of the consent decrees and validate them, it has a devastating impact, not necessarily on the police departments, but on the people that need the protection. So what do I see? Just a terrible, terrible miscarriage of justice. And I do see many legal challenges. But while the legal challenges go through the system, where ultimately, if they're kicked up to the U.S. Supreme Court, we have a very, very, very one-sided Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So undoubtedly, unless there's some loophole or something, maybe there's a good chance that the president's actions will be upheld by this U.S. Supreme Court. What's going to happen is there's going to be confusion on the street level, and there's going to be devastation on the street level because guess what? The police, knowing that they are armed with this consent decree, which they probably hated, these consent decrees being thrown out the window, will basically be back to business as usual, which is what prompted the need for the consent decrees.
In the first place. Texas State
Absolutely.
Representative Ron Reynolds.
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There you go.
So welcome. I want to echo my amazing frat brother Daryl Jones, as well as the illustrious, amazing C.K. Hoffler and her wisdom that they just gave. Yeah, that's right. That the D9 representing. And let me say this: that this is all by design. Let's not pretend. Let's be realistic. Let's be very transparent about what is taking place before our very eyes. The Trump administration is hell bent on making America great again by rolling back the clock of the protections that were afforded to us because of the struggle of many people who, of good conscience, not just black people, but of good conscience that wanted to be believe in equality. They believe that people should be there should be equal justice for people regardless of their race or their ethnicity or their national origin. And these protections were built so that they could address the systemic racism that was permeating our criminal justice system and America in general. So these laws and these consent decrees were there to address wrongs. We know that there were so many disparities with our police in system as related to police interaction with black men, particularly. And so these consent decrees were necessary. And thankfully, you had people under the President Biden administration that were through the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division, that were doing their best to level set and address these, particularly in the awakening of the George Floyd murder, right? There was a national call to action and people saying enough is enough. We need criminal justice reform. Unfortunately, Congress did not pass the George Floyd Policing Act. It stalled in the Senate. The House did pass the bill under the leadership of the Democrat majority in the House under Speaker Pelosi, and it did not pass in the Senate because of the filibuster. It died, and unfortunately they could not get consensus to break the filibuster to pass any criminal justice reform bill comprehensive after George Floyd's death. So these consent decrees were there for a reason. And Santita, make no mistake about it. Without these consent decrees, CK was just saying, business as usual. They are going to have a green light to harm and bring carnage on black and brown communities. They're going to be emboldened because they know there's no repercussions. There's no Department of Justice that's going to bring down their back. The courts, the Supreme Court, as CK was just saying, it's we have to file the challenges. You have to litigate, but we know that this 7 justices, that there is a conservative 5 justices, and to get a majority opinion that sustains righteousness and justice prevailing under this Supreme Court is questionable based on what we've seen recently. So I think that we're in some very troubled times, but it's not a time for us to retreat, but we have to be real about the present circumstances. And what I'm seeing is the Texas legislature being more emboldened. We see that. So Project 2025 is at play. And this is a part of the playbook to give. But here's the thing I want to say really quickly. Shame on them for saying they want to back the blue when they just pardoned 1,500 felons that many of them cause carnage and harm to our police officers. So there's a bunch of hypocrisy. They're not really backing the blue. They're really doing everything they can to put their foot on black and brown communities. That's what they're doing. We can't let them control the narrative of patriots. We're backing the blue. Blue lives matter. We're law and order. They are about white supremacy. And I know those are strong words, but when people show you who they are, believe them. Maya Angelou was right. And I'm seeing that left and right with the rollback of so many different things, not just DEI, as Daryl Jones said, but with equal rights amendments, with civil rights, with voting rights, with women's reproductive rights. I'm seeing so much, and this is just only in the first week. So if we're not fighting, if we're not speaking truth to power and pushing back, it's only going to get worse. So yes, I do believe these consent decrees are necessary to help, and I'm very concerned about the future of law enforcement under President Trump's administration, particularly with his Justice Department, with his Attorney General, with his FBI director, with his CIA director, with his cabinet, and many of the people running the government. I'm very concerned about the future for Black and brown communities.
Well, you know, at Black and brown communities, and quite frankly, dissenters. Because I think white dissenters are in trouble. I think this is a just unbridled power. And, you know, and Jamie Calvin of the Invisible Institute, and brilliant journalist, someone to whom I have so much admiration. I've got Chappelle down there in the chat. That's why I'm gonna bring her up. I know she doesn't want to be brought to the stage, but I'm gonna bring her up anyway. I don't care. But of course, she has a tremendous podcast. Jamie, of course, helped to pull that together. On The Intercept, they had more than 2 million views. And when she talked about the tragedy of the killing of her son, we still don't know who did it. We do know that the police did not help him. And magically, the cameras were off. I mean, and it's been years, and we still don't know. But I tell you what, something happened up the street from me. And Jamie, I follow you assiduously, so I don't know how I missed this story. But here it is. And this is from August of 2022. From The Intercept, justifications begin immediately. That is, as soon as these police officers misbehave, this blue wall goes up, and inside of the tent, they start changing the narrative in real time in front of the people who witnessed the killing. Why don't you explain what happened to my neighbor?
Sure.
That's what this young man was. I mean, and this happened. Just explain it, because I mean, when I read it, and I'm going to tweet it out for everybody and put it on Blue Sky, because if you want to see, it's brilliantly written. It is vigorously investigated. But what it does, CK and Attorney C.K. Hoffler and State Representative Ron Reynolds and Attorney Daryl Jones and Chappelle Wells, it takes you inside of this man's killing. And it walks you through, and I'm going to pass it to you, Jamie, with your Oscar-nominated documentary Incident. It walks us through how the police they knew what happened, and they said, look, this is how we're going to work this out. Jamie Calvin, what happened to Mr. Augustus?
So first, I just want to say, in response to a couple of things that were said about the consent decree issue, I think the really critical thing to attend to is the symbolic message that's being sent by this administration in withdrawing from consent decrees. Consent decrees are useful. They're important. They're really limited in what they can accomplish, and often they become kind of technocratic, changes in policy on paper that don't really affect the lived experience of people in the neighborhood subjected to abusive policing. But they're a tool, they're important. But I think the real message being sent here is that the gloves are coming off, no restraint on law enforcement at all. I mean, I think we're really looking at the reestablishment of a kind of Jim Crow legal system, including, and reference was made to the January 6th insurrectionists, including the kind of paramilitary, extra legal violence of something like the Klan. I mean, this is a sort of parallel phenomena with these groups. So I think, as important as the act of withdrawing, I think the message that's being sent is the thing we should be most concerned about. Having said that, the incident that the film is about occurred in the summer of 2018. 37-year-old barber in South Shore, resident in the neighborhood, tradesman working in a barbershop, was walking home, having done his last haircut for the day, walking home to his home a few blocks away on 71st Street. This is a street he had walked countless times before. just in the course of coming and going, in his everyday life. He was stopped by officers who were, I thought of them kind of as scarecrows. They weren't really on a gun seizure operation or anything. They just sort of been asked to be present on the street. There was a gang clique was kind of frisky. And so shopkeepers had asked for a police presence, but they're really there in a very kind of passive, almost loitering sort of way. Several of them are rookie officers, probationary officers, white. And they noticed that that Mr. Augustus appeared to have a gun. Well, we live in a concealed carry state where it's not a crime to carry a gun, unless there's some other reason for an investigatory stop, a crime committed a block away, and within the perpetrator had used a gun, something like that. In any case, the young officers signaled to an older, seasoned black officer, Quincy Jones, that Mr. Augustus appeared to have a gun. Jones stopped Augustus on the street. He's immediately compliant. They're having a totally civil conversation. You can't hear it because the officers were late to turn on their body camera, and there's a sort of 30-second lapse between the image and the sound. But I interviewed a witness, a security guard who was standing right there, and he said, completely polite, appropriate conversation. Nobody likes to be stopped by the police, but Mr. Augustus, probably assumed the worst that would happen was he would be cited. He was taking his wallet out to show his FOID card, his firearm ownership card. And the three young officers sort of encircled him from his blind side. And one of them, they all were intending to grab at him. One of them grabbed at him. He bolted, was startled, stumbled into the street. And one of the young officers, Dylan Halley, shot him 5 times. This was in the Great Chicago case that precipitated our consent decree. It was the killing of Laquan McDonald. The trial of Laquan McDonald was to start that fall. This was, in the summer, it was to start that fall. Lots and lots of tension in Southside communities. The expectation was that the officer who shot Laquan McDonald would be acquitted. He, in fact, was convicted of second-degree murder, but just the tension in the city was tremendous. So here's this, 37-year-old man, surely had a lot of experience just being a black man on the South Side with problematic police encounters, who thinks he's having one kind of interaction. And it turns out he didn't have a concealed carry card, which is also required. But had he had one, he would not have had an opportunity to show it. Or these officers tackled him, stumbled into the street. He shot 5 times, falls to the ground. And when the officers go over, the first thing they do, and this is within policy, is they handcuff him.
Even though he's on the ground.
Well, he may have been dead at that point.
He may have been dead already.
It's within policy to handcuff a corpse. And then an officer unfastens his holster to take his gun out. Now, that's a significant fact because immediately the narrative starts to form of what had happened. And the officer who shot and the female officer who had first grabbed at him, in the moments after, go through this kind of call and response. Did he have a gun? Yes, he had a gun. He was going to shoot us, wasn't he? He pulled on us. He was going to shoot us. You saved me. Back and forth. They're sort of hysterical at that point.
Well, but before you continue, I was also struck by the first thing she did was a calming exercise.
Yeah, she's worried. But the thing that's so poignant, and you will have read the article, Santita, in the film. This is even stronger.
Yeah.
Is for a number of minutes, Harith Augustus is lying on the ground. Nobody knows whether he's dead or alive. Nobody ministers to him. Nobody says a comforting word. I mean, beyond putting the handcuffs on. Nobody. And when you think about it, think about Michael Brown. Think about Laquan McDonald. That's a constant. In every one of these cases, there are two things that are constant. The person who has been the victim of state violence is also treated like an inanimate object. I mean, nobody intervenes at all, just at the level of basic humanness, right? It's almost like, if you were driving and you came around a corner and you inadvertently hit somebody and didn't look to see what their condition was. But the second thing, and this is, I think, the essence of the film, and I think a really, critically important point, is the narrative starts to form immediately. And what you have is a phenomena where police behavior, police conduct produces the so-called split second where they decide to use lethal force. So the telling thing here, we fought for 13 months to get the Laquan McDonald video released, dash cam video that showed what had happened.
And let me say to the audience, Attorney C.K. Hoffler, Texas State Representative Ron Reynolds, Attorney Darrell Jones, and of course, Chappelle Wells already knows this. He essentially broke the Laquan McDonald case because it was Jamie Calvin who fought to get the video released, and the city and then the country, we were on pins and needles because we knew then that the mayor had been hiding this in the service of being reelected. And we said he's going to have to get out of this if what we think is on this tape is there. He's going to have to go. It was Jamie Calvin who doggedly pursued the release of that tape. So let me just say that because everyone needs to know that. That's part of the reason we have so much love and respect for him. Because to go up against the police in Chicago, you're taking your life into your hands, trust and believe.
But the telling thing about that parallel is it took 13 months, people in the street, litigation, my reporting, other people's reporting, to finally have the video released. And it was, an earthquake when it happened. There was a whole cascade of things. Police chief fired, the head of the agency that investigated police violence fired, state's attorney voted out of office, and the DOJ came in at that point to investigate the department. But in this case, in the case of Harith Augustus, the police department released video in less than 24 hours in order to show that he in fact had a gun. You could see the outline of his gun as he fell into the street. So the remarkable thing here is that there was this whole sequence of things that the police did, starting with a stop that was unjustified, and then an effort to physically detain him that was unjustified, and then they precipitate this moment, which in the law is referred to as the moment of the deadly moment or the split second. And the officer makes a judgment whether to use lethal force or not. And that's still the law, that it's just that narrow window. Does he have a gun? Does he not have a gun? Is it a cell phone? Is it a gun? Is he drawing? Is he not drawing? So there's huge deference shown the assessment of risk and danger by the officer in the split second. But when you think about it, think about all the cases again, just like that body laying on the ground unattended. Think about all the cases that have commanded public attention in this era. Think about, start with the most celebrated, George Floyd, a guy allegedly passing a counterfeit 20. This is not a life and death situation for anybody.
No.
Eric Gardner, an older street hustler selling loose cigarettes on the street. Tamir Rice, a little boy playing with a toy gun in the playground. In every one of those instances, the police produce the split second in which they then feel justified to use lethal force. That's what this article really focuses on. And then the film, ultimately, I was able to get through litigation, all of the body camera footage of all of the officers involved in the incident and then in the aftermath, the crime scene. So we had about 20 hours of body camera footage, completely unedited. So we were able, and with a brilliant director of the film, Bill Morrison, to recreate the everything that was going on in this kind of chaotic crime scene. So the film is a 30-minute short documentary. Santita can share the link. It's public now. That is totally composed out of surveillance footage, 99% body camera, and then one of those stationary pod cameras. But I think the thing to realize, and this is why this ongoing struggle is so important over these the broader issues, is the prevailing paradigm in the law remains this notion of the split second. And the competing idea is that courts need to assess the totality of the circumstances, all the different acts of the police that produce that moment. But we're not there yet. And if you survey there's not a single case of police violence in this era where the police intervened in a highly violent situation, and had to make a life or death decision.
In that split second.
They produced the split second in which they used deadly force.
CK, is there a case? I mean, and I have problems with these cases. I've said this to you before, because after you've taken someone's loved one, someone's beloved, you can't pay me enough money. I mean, you really can't. I mean, and at some point, somehow or another, the police are like the military. They can just keep cutting checks. They keep shooting people and they keep cutting checks. And it's like nothing changes because they keep paying you out. And then, we cry for a minute, you have a big funeral, and then somebody else gets shot. And another check gets cut. But what? Is there a case here from what you're hearing?
Well, there's always a case. Of course, there's a case. Okay. But what we have to look at, Santita, is the climate, the political climate within which we're operating. That's very, very pertinent to what the likelihood of success is of the case. Now, having said that, there are groups, organizations that have historically taken on these types of battles. And of course, there are individuals that take on these cases, many of them. But in our system, because of the fact, especially now, you're going to be facing an uphill battle with the litigation, I believe. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It's just you're going to be facing an uphill battle, and there are creative ways and collaborative ways to address these types of injustices. I think when families look to the monetary, to look to getting paid for, and they're never going to be paid the value of the life.
Or being compensated. I don't want to cheapen.
Well, compensated, paid, however you say. There's nothing negative about that. That is our system here in the United States. There is no better way to compensate a family. You can put in place reforms, and then you have a president that comes through and reverses all of that. So for families who have lost their loved ones wrongfully, their strongest bet is civil litigation, is being compensated, being paid, however you put it. And it's devastating, of course, because as we all have lost someone, sometimes you're like, there is not any amount of money. And sometimes you think it's blood money, you don't want money. But in our system, that is the only way that people can really be compensated, to try to compensate for the value of one's life. And then how do people value one's life? In different states and different jurisdictions, there's different criteria of how to lay the evidence to value one's life. And some states, it's the value of what they missed, what they will never see, what they'll never experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the evidence of all their loved ones. That's why you see, people's loved ones testifying and saying what a great person that person was. In other states, it's the value of that person's life through the eyes of that person. That's a very, very different way of looking at how you value lives. But no matter how you slice it, what every family member would say, I would best believe, is that for one day, 1 second, one more minute with their loved one, what they wouldn't do, they'd give up all that money because you love
Absolutely.
your loved one. But Santita,
And I wasn't trying to diminish that at all. I mean, really, because I've not been in that position.
No, I know, and we have this discussion. We've had this discussion many times, and because I am in this space where I am an advocate for those families, and I do help those families, I recognize that this is the system that we have here in the United States.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to others, like the Justice Department getting involved, like state governments like other entities getting involved, other third-party groups that serve as advocates for those who are downtrodden, who don't have a voice, and there are many, many, many of them that litigate cases like this and that feel there's a public interest. They will continue doing that work. But then again, with the litigation, you're looking at where it will escalate eventually to, and that is that U.S. Supreme Court. So when people say, well, it doesn't matter who's on the U.S. Supreme Court, it doesn't matter who the federal judges are, it doesn't matter who the judges are, they are 100% wrong. And the only time you really feel it is when you're in the system, when you have a case, when you're being an advocate, and when your case is escalating up through the system, and when you encounter roadblocks where some judges feel there's no such thing as racism, that there should never have been a such thing as DEI or DE&I, however you slice it, that people are whining and crying unnecessarily, and there's no need for any legislation. There's no need for any measures to level the playing field. There are many people who feel that way, many federal judges who feel that way, and people on our U.S. Supreme Court, not to mention this administration. So we have to look at, Santita, even more so, what do we do if we're advocates on behalf of people who are victims and their families? We have to be creative. All is not lost. There's a lot to work with and a lot to do, but I can tell you, this isn't our proudest moment.
But that's Jamie. Let me go back to you before I go to you, Daryl, and Representative Reynolds, and Chaparral. You feel free to comment, because you have to go through all of these hoops, Jamie, in case after case after case, to get the video footage, right? And the consent decree in Chicago, okay, does it make a difference? And what do you think of what the Trump administration is putting forth now?
So I think I'm thinking about the last set of comments about, compensation in civil suits and such, which of course is critically important. And we don't ever begrudge, the victims of police violence, compensation. In my experience, having, reported on a number of cases that gave rise to civil rights suits, some of which ended in substantial settlements. What's always been interesting to me is that people so rarely get from the legal system what they aspire to, which is a kind of narrative justice, a telling of the reality of what happened. And most civil suits are going to be settled without going to trial. So there will not be an acknowledgement of what actually happened. There will not be remedies addressed to what happened. So, I think, Santita, you said initially something along the lines of it just becomes a way of maintaining the status quo, which is certainly not the intention of the civil rights bar.
Absolutely.
And there's brilliant lawyering that goes on. But I think what we're most frustrated by right now is, we can celebrate an exoneration of somebody who's been wrongfully convicted. We can celebrate a seven-figure settlement in such a case. Nothing about the underlying conditions that gave rise to those harms changes. and the consent decrees at least aspire to, chip away at that. And I think that's kind of what we're up against. We're all sort of inside this thing, including the police. I mean, they're, in any police department, they're not, it's not this monolithic thing. They're people who would share our values, as well as some folks who, are just the polar opposite. But we can't seem to figure out how to get off the train, how to change these patterns. And one of the things, allow me one other observation that really my reporting has brought me to, particularly this case, the Harith Augustus case, is at least in the public understanding of, racist police abuse, there is the prevailing narrative that the problem is proactively racist officers. Derek Chauvin would be a candidate for that just based on his actions. But, you could, and I think that is a problem. I'm not dismissing the problem, but I'm not sure it's the problem. You could expel those guys from law enforcement, the ones who you can identify as being, as they used to say on the street, KKK under blue and white. You could expel all those guys from law enforcement and still have outcomes like the Harith Augustus, this absurd, tragic, wasteful, gratuitous killing of a Black man, because you have a system that will keep producing these outcomes, and it doesn't depend on the kind of rabid racist to drive the action. And that's where we have, I think, to date, just not been able to get traction in making meaningful changes.
Daryl, this is resonating with you. Why?
Well, a couple of things, Santita. One of the things that Brother Calvin was saying with regards to a lot of the bias in policing, it's not white-black bias. That's not just what it's about. This is an inherent bias that's there. It's an inherent devaluation of Black life that's there. And I lift that up as an example using Tyree Nichols, right? Tyree Nichols, it wasn't the white officers that were simply involved, yet Black officers that
They
were there.
all, I mean, with the exception of one, they were all Black.
They're all Black officers.
Ethelene, because she wanted to talk about that, yet I just have to go back to her, because she said, wait a minute. She said, how do all of you feel? Speak to this, Daryl. How do you all feel about the Memphis consent decree? The cops there brutally murdered Tyree Nichols, but the police chief refused to sign the consent decree. I mean, how do we deal with this problem? And then, see, when I was a child, you had Renault Robinson, who was one of the first Blacks, prominent Blacks on the police force. And he created the Black Patrolmen's League. That's, loosely what it was called. And they were advocates in the community. They were stopping crime. You remember them, Jamie Calvin?
Oh, I do. Howard Saffold. I love those guys. Yeah. And
that's not who got Tyree Nichols. Something has happened, because all of these guys killed this guy, and then they were going to cover. I'm like, what, Daryl? What is this?
And there's a multi-layer answer that goes along with it. But one of the things that we've got to remember is that the police chief generally is someone who's appointed by a mayor or by a county executive. Okay, so you got to look at the political side of that. When we're talking about Memphis and the police chief there, that police chief came from Atlanta, Georgia, and was one of the ones that headed up their Red Dog unit, right? Where they were going after all these people, all this rough housing with regards to how they were over policing in the African-American community. That's the same police chief that's now in Memphis. So when we're talking about the Memphis consent decree, let's first look at why the police chief is there and why she continues to stay there. What's going on there, right? That's a question that's got to be answered. In addition to that, when we're talking about the consent decree in Memphis, let's remember this. It was a very quick investigation that was done by the Department of Justice. Why very quick? I think it was maybe 10 months or something like that. Why very quick? Because it was so pronounced. The actions of what were going on there were so pronounced. They didn't need 2 years to do the investigation. They did it with
Oh, Daryl. Oh my
11
goodness.
months. That's how pronounced and horrible the treatment was there. That is there. What, oh, did you lose me?
Oh no, I got you. We got you.
Uh-oh.
You're here. You're here, Daryl. Well, you know what? Stay right there, Representative Ron Reynolds, because you are nodding your head vigorously in assent, or at least you're nodding it vigorously. What's
Am I
going
back?
on?
You're back. You're back.
You're back. Okay, and before we get to you, Ron, before you jump through the screen, Attorney Daryl Jones. Jones, I wanted to,
So
but you were speaking
when
to
all of
the rapidity of, was it a cursory investigation or was it thorough? Or was it just so flagrant, so obvious what happened here? What was it?
it was right. Right. It's so incredibly flagrant that they didn't need 2 years to see what was going on there. And so that's why that was being reported. What becomes even more unsettling in my mind is that the elected officials in Memphis were resisting entering into any type of a consent decree because they were trying to wait for the next president to be elected, knowing that he would be against any type of consent decree. And that's the standing of where they are now. That's the problem, with situations like this. That's one of the biggest problems that they're encountered. And I'm sure that Brother Calvin will tell you that the Fraternal Order of Police are one of those entities that are going to try to hold everything up. They do not want anything to have the public get quick access to information, easy access to information. Most major cities usually have in place, because of the FOP, a cooling off period where you can't even talk to the officer about the shooting for a period of time. What's happening during that period of time when it's freshest in their mind? And CK and Ron will both tell you, on the lawyer side, we say, you get the truth when you get it closest to when it happened, right? Not when you've given the person an opportunity to think about it, to talk to other people about it, to adjust the story so that it fits a framing that they want to put in place. But that's what we see happening consistently throughout the country with all of the policing and all of the interactions that go on. So when you talk about Memphis, those are some of the issues that immediately jump out at me with regards to problems that are there. And the question is, how do you fix it? It's got to start because that chief of police was appointed by that mayor. You've got to ask the mayor, why is that chief still here? Here's what she did in Atlanta. She's here, she's doing the same thing with the same results and another dead body in the streets. There's something that needs to be changed.
Oh, well, Representative Ron Reynolds, Sonia Massey down in Springfield. This police officer had he just had so much carnage in his wake, and he kept getting rehired by the police departments. I am not laughing in comedy. This is a rueful laugh, everybody. Jamie, this is unbelievable. They get passed from department to department, and you're on the political side. You're an elected official. Talk to us, because there are political implications. We lost a mayor over this. Thank you, Jamie. Because Jamie, that's on you.
What do we get in exchange?
Santita, let me say, I can't agree more with Daryl in the passionate response that he just gave. There has to be, first of all, accountability for the officer, but the people, the police chief and the whole department, it falls on the city council, the mayor and council, who is there to hire and fire the police chief. And so elections matter. The community has a responsibility and an obligation to go to those city council members and demand justice. That is what those city council members do, because guess what? They're the ultimate boss of the mayor and the city council. And if you don't like what they're doing, then you need to go make your voices heard. And if they don't want to change it, then you need to get their butts fired, because elections matter. And there's no excuse in a city like Memphis. I was born in Jackson, Tennessee. So this isn't what you would call white on black crime. This is black on black crime. And that is, we don't justify or turn our eyes because it's a black officer committing a crime on a black officer. We want accountability, transparency, regardless of the color of the officers, because too often those officers, when they get their uniform on, it's about the blue, right? And one of the things that we know from research is that there are so many implicit biases. That is why those consent decrees often require training to overcome the stigma of the implicit bias on black men. What do I mean by that? The implicit bias from the media that black men are animals, that we're criminals, that we are dangerous. And so when they have that perception with that implicit bias, they're overly aggressive in how they approach us. And therefore you see more escalation where normally there's trained for de-escalation. When there's implicit bias involved, even as a black officer seeing another black civilian that is allegedly viewed as dangerous, they're treating that person differently than they would if the suspect was Caucasian or even Asian or some other race. And so that is one of the reasons why these consent decrees are so important, is because a lot of times these officers need extra training. And then there needs to be accountability to make sure that you make rules and examples out of officers that are bad. No, all officers aren't bad, but a bad apple certainly spoils a bunch. And when a bad officer gets away with things, it makes it harder for the community to have trust when they see these bad officers committing these offenses and then they're back on the force. There needs to be, that is one of the reasons why we try to take away qualified immunity in the George Floyd Policing Act, because police with that qualified immunity, they are shielded often from civil liability. Criminal liability, there's a high bar, but even civil liability is almost non-existent, that they can have damages. And sometimes you have to hit them in the pocketbook where it hurts for these departments to clean the acts up. And with qualified immunity, it's almost impossible to bring a cause of action under Section 1983 or anything else for damages. So yes, Santita, we need much reform. I see it going in the wrong direction. The disparities are going to get worse. There was at least a transparency and a flashlight on America's police departments after George Floyd. I think we're going in the opposite direction now. We're going back to the days where you just, do what you want to do, maintain law and order. That is what President Trump has promoted on the campaign trail. That is what he's promoting, militarizing the police, right? Now, I want to say this other thing. The narrative that they tried to get us with was that we didn't want policing. We didn't want to have law and order. No, we in the black community, we want law enforcement, but we want law enforcement to be there to serve and protect, not to harm and single out, not to treat us differently, not to have racial profiling, not to have pretextual stops where they're profiling blacks for false stuff because they think they fit the profile. We want law and order, that they're there to keep our community safe, not plague on our communities. So Black Lives Matter was really emerged to speak out for those issues, not to say that other lives don't matter, but we simply want Black lives to matter. And I think that Trump is showing us that Black lives really don't matter. And that is what we're seeing with these rollbacks of these consent decrees and these executive orders being rolled out.
But sadly, he's not alone. I mean, 2 weeks after we saw Rodney King beaten half to death, Biden, when he was a senator, went on the floor of the U.S. Senate and called for a police officer's Bill of Rights. I mean, we have the police. I used to have officer friendly. Now the police are called the force. They enforce the law. They don't preserve the peace. I mean, something has changed in the society, and Eisenhower tried to tell us. We didn't listen. So I literally have like a minute for everybody. I'm going to have to give Jamie a little bit more time because everyone, he might be clutching that gold statue. And guess what? We're going to put ourselves in that picture. We're going to do just like we're going to photobomb him virtually. AI. Let me go around and get a minute from everybody. Because I know this is not the last time that we're going to visit this. and everything that you all have said. I mean, and the thing is, everybody's bringing up cases from all over the country. And, a friend of mine, Sean, put it so well. Thank you, Max. He said, you don't want the police on your back, but you want them to have your back. I can't put it any more simply than that. Attorney Daryl Jones, your closing thought.
Yeah,
Okay.
my closing thoughts are just very direct, and that is that we've got to be certain we hold elected officials accountable to the degree that we can, and it's so important that that we stand with those elected officials when they're doing right, and when they're not doing right, that we hold them accountable. So I think it's just incredibly important that when we're dealing with the consent decrees, that we understand that these are decrees that are being entered into, and that there can be political pressure that can be applied to try to be certain that the consent decrees are put in place, and that they are being followed and acted upon in our best interest. And most importantly, I think that it also demonstrates, and let's not forget that it's not just the federal government that into this decree, it's the state government that can also enter into the decree. And if you have a local elected body, you can push them as well.
Amen to that. Texas State Representative Ron Reynolds, you're the elected
Yes.
on the panel. Help us.
Well, Santita, it is incumbent upon us to not grow weary in well-doing. And even though these consent decrees are being rolled back, even though the MAGA agenda that was predetermined and forecasted with Project 2025 is coming to fruition, we cannot grow weary. What do I mean by that? We must continue to fight. We must continue to push back against the fascism that exists, the racist, discriminatory laws, to make sure that on our watch we don't allow them to go back. Even though we may lose because they have the power, we cannot allow them to do this without fighting. And that means everyone of good conscience, not just blacks, but good white people and Hispanic and Asians, all of us with common interests have to be on the right side of history, demanding justice and accountability for all. And that is the police, and anyone in power should be even held to a higher standard, because those people have a gun and a badge, which is a tremendous responsibility. And they take an oath to serve and protect all of us, not just some, or the well-off or the well-to-do.
Okay, my time is getting tight, but CK, inside of a minute. Of course, she is on Court TV. Check her out. Let them know we want her to have a show. You have not, because you asked not. Go on. Chair of Rainbow Push. Go on.
Well,
and of course, Daryl is on WOL every Tuesday, 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. By the time you listen to this, switch over from this show and go to WOL so you can hear his show. And she's on WAOK at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday. Boom. There you go.
all right. We need to really just brace ourselves, because right now we're talking about consent decrees as it relates to police misconduct. But I got news for you. There are other consent decrees, such as consent decrees that the EEOC implements and executes throughout the country for a discriminatory conduct in corporate America. So what's going to be very interesting, since this administration has eliminated DE&I and other related protections, it's going to be very interesting to see what their next steps will be as it relates to other types of consent decrees, where companies have been forced to bring about changes in their employment practices because they discriminated against a group of people that were in a protected class. So I think we have to brace ourselves, but I think also this is going to encourage and promote us to go back to community and to use, because they're rolling back the clock, we've got to be creative and fast forward the clock to make sure that we continue to protect people in our communities and ourselves and our families.
And the thing is, we can do that. Jamie Calvin, The Invisible Institute, of course, your Oscar-nominated documentary. With your permission, I will post it. I'm very excited. I'm going to share it with everyone. And I hope you will talk about it on your shows tomorrow, Attorney Daryl Jones and Attorney C.K. Hoffler, because I got through like 25 minutes of it, and it is very, very powerful. And of course, because of him, we saw the Laquan McDonald video. We would not have seen it had he not been so dedicated to letting the world know what had happened to this boy, what had happened to this child.
So
And so I want to thank you for that. Jamie Calvin, of course, the movie is Incident, so you're going to make me watch the Academy Awards. I haven't watched in a long time.
I'm sure we'll have all of 15 seconds, but the I think the thing that I find myself thinking about as I listen to people's sort of final remarks is we've learned a lot in the last decade plus, whatever we're going to call this era. And one of the things we've learned is that there is a tremendous resistance in these institutions to change. I mean, I deal with FOP all the time in Chicago.
I know you're their favorite.
I am their favorite, and we contend with each other all the time. But they're confident that they can outlast reform, and their confidence is being rewarded by this administration. So so there's that reality, but then there's also the reality that there have been significant. The very fact that we're talking about Laquan McDonald and this film that we were able to make, there have been huge advances in transparency in what is not perfect by far, but in what people now expect by way of information about serious acts of police misconduct and abuse. 10 years ago, you never would have gotten the video. It was just not a possibility. So we don't want to lose sight of the things that have in fact occurred by way of progress. But the only progress is that has really been realized is because people were in the streets. It's because civil society pushed for change. That's what made the political reality that affected office holders and leaders of agencies. And in the absence of that pressure, if we are not bringing that kind of pressure, then I think the status quo owns the day. But we know that works if it's sustained. Anyway, I mean, I think that's where I invest my hopes for the future in this lousy period we're in.
Well, you know what? I think I have to tell you, I feel very hopeful about this period because it's waking us up. I think that the great thing about this period, I think that we have been asleep and we should not have been. We've had a rollback on our civil rights, our civil liberties. But sometimes because we trust the people in the high places, we say, it's not as bad. No, I am the rabbit in the water and it has been boiling, y'all. And I've just gotten used to this hot boiling water. I don't want to be eaten. Now, we have to make a decision about whether we're going to be ruled or whether we're going to be governed.
Mm-hmm.
We have to get educated. When we're educated, we can be governed. You're ruled when you have no information. That has nothing to do with your degree. That has everything to do with your spiritual pedigree, whether you want to be free or not. It's our decision.
Yeah.
And so I want you to know that I want to thank all of you today because all of you are freedom fighters. I want to thank you, Attorney Darrell Jones, for all of the work that you do with the Transformative Justice Coalition. We've got to get you back so we can talk about what's happened with the Ahmaud Arbery case down in Georgia with the prosecutorial misconduct. Jamie, I don't know if you know about that case, but it's a lot.
Yeah, I do.
Of course you do. And Texas State Representative, of course, tomorrow, should I say today, by the time you all hear this, please go to WOLDC and listen to Barbara Arnwine and Darrell Jones, 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. WAOK, everywhere. Of course, that's Attorney C.K. Hoffler at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And she's on Court TV throughout the week, chair of Rainbow Push. I don't know how she does it all. And she still practices law. Well, so does Darrell. What? And of course, Texas State Representative Ron Reynolds. I'm so glad that he's in his office. He hasn't run away because that's when I met him when he was trying to deny the governor a quorum. I ain't mad at you. Head of the Black Caucus down there. And of course, Jamie Calvin, we are pulling for you. Thank you, Chaparral, for always helping me pull this show together every day. Trying to act like that she's quiet. She's not. But of course, Jamie Calvin, we're pulling for you. But we're so glad that the Academy, that they have acknowledged this movie and your work. Incident. But you give us a reason to watch the Academy Awards, and I don't care. I'm going to be watching it. All I want to know is who's going to win the documentary. How about that part? It's going to be on TV. Yes. And of course, that is the movie Incident. incident. And of course, we need to support the Invisible Institute. They do such magnificent work. I love you all, everybody. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for being part of the family. And I will see you tomorrow. I'm going to have Greg Palast on, everybody, on AM 950 radio. Guess what? He uncovered 3.5 million votes that were suppressed. He said, guess what? Kamala Harris should have won, and he's got the evidence. I cannot wait to hear it. I love everybody. God bless you. AM 950
Wow.
radio, the Santita Jackson
Take
Show.
care, all.